Ashlee, would you please like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Ash from sunny Sydney in Australia, currently in London in the UK. I've had 12 years under my belt in HR, but currently the people director at Pirate Studios, which is a global scale-up business providing creative space for all. And we essentially provide a global network of music studios that you can hire by the hour. I originally moved to the UK so I could try and get some more travel done, as well as grow my career through a global platform, which I've been able to tick that off, not so much the travel side of things because I arrived here just before COVID hit. But yeah, really passionate about the mental health space in the workplace. It's something I've been working on for most of my career now, and really passionate about how we can make a difference there.
Perfect. Then we've also got Rose.
Yeah, okay. My name's Rose Fisher, and I'm based in the north of England, and I am a counsellor. I qualified 21 years ago, and then as a counsellor. But more recently, in 2016, I qualified as a supervisor. So I supervise counsellors who are in training. And that has given me a lot, sort of like an accelerated learning. So I'm learning through each of my supervisees about, you know, the work that they're doing with their clients. It's been really rewarding. I've been here 31 years in Lancaster. And I did go away for 5 years. I went to Vancouver and worked there. And that was really interesting because of the neighborhood that I worked in. It was an inner city neighborhood called the Downtown East Side, where there's a lot of addiction. There's a lot of urban natives. So like there's their issues of leaving the reservations and coming to live in the city. And also a lot of homeless people, and also a lot of agencies that were similar to the agency that I worked with. So there was a lot of learning through there. I have a private practice at the moment, and that keeps me busy, but I did retire sort of formally because of age 4 years ago. So I've got a fairly quiet life with I want to say a lot of learning. So I've said learning several times in my introduction. I guess that's me.
Perfect. Sounds great. Thanks, Rose. Really appreciate it. And then last but not least, we've got Davina as well. Davina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, and so hi everyone. My name is Davina. I'm the Health and Wellbeing Director at Zevo Health. At Zevo, we work with organizations to support them with their wellbeing programs. So deliver anything from training to consultancy work. We do a bit of research as well. And in addition to that, we have tech-based platforms. So whether it's the app or online platform, and our newest product is the EAP. So it's great to kind of see workplace wellbeing evolve in a very evidence-based way, and that's what we want to continue bringing to our organizations that we work with. My background is in health psychology, and I've worked in a range of industries from children's services to construction to financial institutions, providing well-being support and interventions. So it's great to be here today and to speak a little bit more about EAP and mental health.
Perfect. Thanks, Davina. And hi, everybody. Great to have you on board. So I wonder whether we start with that, because you mentioned the EAP a couple of times, and it's, you know, something that, it's something that kind of comes up a lot, this EAP provision and the benefits of it, but how we can make it better as well. So I'd love to hear some thoughts. I guess the starting point for anyone who doesn't know what an EAP, does anyone want to tell me a little bit more about an employee assistance program, what they do, what it involves, how do they work? I don't know. Davina, do you want to kick off with that?
Sure, yeah. So your employee assistance program is a work-based intervention, and it's designed to provide access to specialist support for a range of issues which are having an impact on the individual. So this can include counselling, but it can also put you in touch with legal and financial support. It just depends on what type of EAP your organisation has purchased. but they're great because they're paid for by the employer. So there's no direct cost to the individual accessing that support, whether it's in their work or personal time. And as we know, accessing support and having cost attached to it can be one of those barriers which holds someone back. But we also know that early intervention is the best thing for anyone. And we'll probably touch on this later on, but just, a lot of the time people delay seeking support because they might minimize their problems, and they might say, oh, I'm not at breaking point, I don't need counselling, I don't need to speak to someone, I don't, it'll be fine. As they say in Ireland, it'll be grand, but what we know from research is actually, early intervention is the best for the individual. If you can link in with someone sooner and have that confidential space to speak to someone, you find that it's easier to navigate through the situation or challenge that you're experiencing. And I'm sure Rose will tell us more as well, just from the counselling perspective. But yeah, you don't need to be at the breaking point and a high level of distress to access any of these services. And as they're readily available, they're just really, really beneficial to have as part of a component of your wellbeing strategy in your organisation.
Yeah, really interesting. And Ashlee, I guess, so you've got experience of implementing an EAP, right, within your current organisation, and so tell me a bit more about the usage of that and how people engage with the EAP.
Yeah, so I think when I first started at Pirate, which was just under 2 years ago now, I guess a theory that I sort of live by is, you don't employ people just for the 8 hours of work that they show up for. You really are employing their whole life and everything that comes with that. And being able to sort of link the benefits of having people with, really good mental health are going to have great outcomes for your business. They're going to be able to perform better and ultimately, deliver more for your business. So I think, first of all, outside of the duty of care, there's always going to be this intrinsic link between, motivating employers to get on board with this sort of thing. And I think, when I did start working at Pirate, I really found that when we didn't have an EAP in place, I was really struggling to manage just the volume of those people who needed extra support and having those conversations with them. Knowing myself, I'm not a trained therapist, we sort of get to a point where our skill sets have their limits. And looking around at our managers, they naturally start to create a divide because they go, I know how to manage them from a work point of view, but I feel scared to have a conversation, or I don't know what I'm going to say if they tell me that I'm not okay. And being able to empower managers, give them the skills, but also somewhere to go as well to help manage the team, I think was really important. So I suppose when we went about looking for an EAP, it really comes down to what do you need and what were the requirements that the business have. And when I looked at Pirate, we needed someone with international coverage. We needed a quick service, someone who would be available for us, in a turnaround of at least 20 or minimum 24 hours. We needed 24/7 support to cover all of our time zones. We needed someone with great tech because it's important for us. We work with very young, cool people, creative people who expect there to be an app to work easily, to look good. But also we wanted a partnership where it was more than just EAP. There were wellness activities that we could start to overlay to really get the message to drive home. So just a short to-do list to get through, but it did take us about a year to find the right provider. Knowing that there are risks if you get it wrong, and if you go with someone who maybe doesn't meet your needs for your business, and you've got people who might be accessing this sort of service for the first time in their life, and if their first experience is poor, they may never access it again. So it felt like quite a big burden to make sure we found that right person. So definitely wasn't easy, but being able to trawl through the number of providers to find the match, I think, I really recommend understanding exactly what you need before you dive in.
Yeah, so I think a really interesting topic to have a look at is around these barriers. And, a couple of you have, kind of touched on potential barriers to access and stop people accessing these things, or even if they do access it, be a barrier to accessing it again. So I guess, Rose, from your perspective, when, EAP or not, when people are engaging with counselling, what kind of barriers do you see from the individual's perspective? Do you come across some of those, or are most of the people who you speak to kind of, they've already made that step, or what do you think?
Well, I think that the very first step is really, really difficult for people. There's a lot of anxiety about just making that step, and making that first phone call. So that it's quite brave of the person to do so, to sort of say, yeah, I could benefit from a talking therapy. The other barriers might be that, like, it's a financial issue, or if it's through the workplace and there's an EAP, as Davina was saying, that's paid for by the employer. But if you want to contact, I'm going to talk from the perspective of someone in private practice. If you are able to pay for a counsellor, then it's a case of finding the right counsellor for yourself as well. So there's an introductory session usually with most counsellors. It's usually very low cost, sometimes even free, for that first session, that first introductory session. It might not be the whole 50 or 60 minutes, it might be 20 minutes. But yeah, just recognizing that you need someone to talk to, that you could benefit by that. So the other thing to mention is that this is a profession, counseling is a profession. So there's a contract. And I'm mentioning that because that adds to the safety for the person, for the individual, that they know that there's going to be confidentiality, that the counsellor has committed to making a safe space for that person to talk. So it's exploring that at the very beginning. You
talked about bravery. I agree wholeheartedly, because I'd feel exactly the same if I was contacting counselling and going down that route. But like, why why does it take bravery? What is it about? Why does a person need to be brave to just admit that they want to have a conversation with somebody else about something?
Okay, so that's a good question. I guess there's the stigma attached to having a mental health issue, or believing that you have a problem. And in fact, that in itself is mostly the most common problem, is that people believe there is something wrong with them. And that may not be the case at all. It usually is not the case at all. So that's why it takes a lot of bravery to just take that first step and find someone out there in your external world who's going to be listening to you, who's going to be empathic and non-judgmental is the important bit. So that you can really just explain it all, because to you it feels complicated and impossible, and it's weighing you down. So that's why it's brave.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I agree, by the way. I'm just interviewing.
Yeah. I thought when I saw this question on the list, I thought I would just share a tiny bit of my personal experience of the very first time I went to counselling, which was about 40 years ago. And my issue then is that I didn't have a voice to sort of say what my needs are to close significant others in my life. And so I was feeling very oppressed. And I remember the counsellor saying, when she first offered me a place, and fortunately I didn't have to wait. The first people I phoned, there was a long waiting list. And in a way that actually made me feel a little bit lighter, to know that, there's so many other people also waiting to see a counsellor. But anyway, I found someone who would see me straight away. And what she said to me is that she heard the sound of despair in my voice. But what I'd like to say is that at least I was only able to see her short term for 6 weeks. And I came away with a gem in the first week. And that was this analogy that she gave me of drinking a glass of water. And she said, if you're thirsty and you drink a glass of water, you know whether or not your thirst has been quenched. No one else can tell you. And that in itself gave me my voice. So I just wanted to share that with everyone.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of people, you know, who watch something like this or think about engaging with an EAP, and those same thoughts are going through their heads. And, you know, it's how do we overcome some of those barriers, I guess. So Davina, from your perspective, because obviously you're in the line of encouraging people to access these services, but correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure on this, but anecdotally, I feel that EAPs in particular are quite underutilized. Is that right? Or am I completely wrong? Or
yeah, no, there are various figures out there. I've seen research that's saying it's as low as 10%, but having worked in the HR space, providing wellbeing support internally to an organization many moons ago, the figures that I was seeing coming back in were as low as 2% utilization across our organization at the time. And I might say something a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but with any service that an employer rolls out, they're really interested to see the return of the investment. But we need to balance that sometimes. We don't want everyone accessing EAP, otherwise there's a problem there that maybe, you know, isn't being managed appropriately. But the flip side that I see that is quite positive is that the people who need it are accessing the services, and hopefully we can work in time to reduce the barriers so that more people feel able to access it. And what I do see as well is that, just as Ashlee was saying, there's this strong leadership and managerial support that's available, so that managers, and especially through the pandemic, are able to have those conversations around well-being, around workplace stress, around workplace demands. And they're able to not just have the transactional conversations, i.e., when is that due? Have you got it there? You know, are we going to hit the deadline? But more so around, you know, how are you doing? You know, is this manageable? And when you're having those conversations, you're able to create buffers to the stress that's being experienced. And I agree that managers, you know, many of them are not counsellors, and they do need this additional support so that they know where they can signpost their employees to. But I would say, in a comforting way, if you are seeing low usage, don't necessarily take that as a bad sign that it's not engaging enough, that people aren't accessing it. Because remember, the EAP is just one source of support, and we don't measure how many times an individual is speaking to a manager, someone else in leadership, HR, to a colleague, you know, and the support there is vast. So we have to kind of think of the usage in terms of all the other supports available in the organization. But what I you know, would say is we've got a real opportunity here with the hybrid working world, because in the past, you know, it's a telephone line that you call. Now there's the digitalization of the service, which fits with the way we're working, because we would have been so trained to think about having a conversation with someone needs to be done face to face. And just like now, all of that has changed. You know, we're online, we're having this conversation here. So I think the perception of how we access support, how we interact with one another in work is changing, and this might create more of an opening for EAP to gain greater traction for team members who either continue to work remotely on a hybrid or are back in the office full time. So I think there are always going to be barriers to accessing support, but it is definitely something that organizations can look to do. And if you do have an EAP in place, you know, this awareness piece is always going to be key. So it's that promotion on your internal communication channels, emails, periodic emails going out. It's events similar to this, you know, and in the past we've done role plays with 2 trained counsellors to play out how that conversation might look, so that if individuals are feeling concerned as to, you know, when you call the line, you might not know how the conversation might go, or if you're going into face-to-face counselling, or, you know, you just you might not be sure. As Rose mentioned, the contracting piece, you know, the understanding why do you need support, what do you hope to get from the session, and even, you know, some of the questions that come up as to, you know, will you inform my employer that I'm accessing support? Who and how will my information be shared? All of these things which raise anxiety can be just, you know, really quickly and calmly, just work through. And that's just kind of feeding back into some of the barriers and the bravery that we spoke of before, because this vulnerability piece of saying I'm stressed, saying I'm not coping, might not necessarily have been the done thing to do in the workplace, for that fear of being perceived that we're unable to do our jobs. But this really isn't the case. A lot of, like, all people experience stress, and we all have mental health, and so at times there are going to be, there will be times when we do struggle, and that's just the natural order of life. So just making people feel normal in that process, and knowing that there's a support around them, that they're not alone in coping with whatever they're going through, is going to be really important. So however you can do that as an organization is so important, and it needs to be done on a periodic basis. As we're saying, we've got World Mental Health Day, which is a great time to raise these conversations, but it's that continual advertisement, promotion, discussing, showing vulnerability, appropriate vulnerability in leadership, in your teams. And if you do manage a team, then one of the great things that I would say to do is find your EAP information and just pin it to your desktop or on your email, so you have it to hand. Because if you ever go into a meeting with a team member and they're distressed, you want to be able to provide that support in real time, but you also need to know your boundaries as a manager and know that you're not overstepping into that counselling line. So having that information handy is really beneficial. And I'd say if you're not sure about EAP, give them a call. Just have a call, just say, I'm phoning as a manager, I just want to get a bit more information. Or so when you're speaking with your team member, you can say, right, you have to call this number, they will ask you X, Y, and Z, and then you'll be assigned, the case manager will assign you a counsellor to work with. And I think that visibility piece is also key. Like, it could be something as simple as just having it on your signature as well, just so team members have it there as that visual prompt every now and then. And then if you are delivering wellbeing training, ask your partner to just include your organization's EAP details on the slide, so that if you're raising a discussion, say you're doing a training on work-life integration, and someone is at this training and they're going, yeah, I can identify with poor work-life integration, or they're finding it hard to do everything and be everything, and they're going, but where do I go now? Then at least you're providing that information to give them access to say, the training is the awareness piece, but if you want to speak to someone about your personal experiences and the challenges that you're having, then here's the next step that you can engage with. So I'd say there's so much that can be done in this space to raise awareness and just continuously work at breaking down some of those barriers.
Yeah. Do you mind if I pull on that thread a little bit? And I might ask Ashlee actually around this question. So you mentioned managers a couple of times there, Davina, and I absolutely agree. They're really well placed to have proactive wellbeing conversations, and it shouldn't just be a transactional role and all that side of things. But the boundaries is a very interesting thing. And I worked with a client recently. I won't tell you their name, but I worked with a client recently, and they said that actually they were worried that their managers were using EAPs too readily. They would, the moment someone started talking about stress, it's like, oh, you need to go speak to the EAP. I can't. But actually, some of those conversations were something that they should be doing, they should be having, because it was something that was a lot more closely connected to something they could potentially do something about. So I guess, Ashlee, how would I frame that as a question? How do you encourage your managers to engage with an EAP service and use it with employees and manage those boundaries and those barriers?
Yeah, I think to start answering that question, I think that the more we talk about EAP and the support that's available, I think the better the message is going to land. So, one of my thoughts around implementing EAP was, let's just keep telling people and let's make it really easy to access. And Davina obviously touched on a few ways in which you can do that. The email signature, I think, is a great idea, but how do we layer it into conversations and make it quite a genuine offer from managers? I think it does start to become quite tricky. And when we did implement our EAP, we went through quite a bit of training, and we did that from a team point of view around what does EAP mean? How do I access it? This is what it is. And, you know, that's great, but we've still got to gain trust. We've still got to get them to believe, you know, that this is a confidential service and my employer won't find out, and they're not going to, you know, share all the deep, dark secrets that I'm sharing. And, you know, that goes further than just one initial launch session, if you like. So we did a series of management training, which we made compulsory, where managers really were given some skills, and quite good life skills really, to take outside of the workplace, to be able to actually ask somebody, are you okay? And what I always say to the managers is, it's not your role to be a therapist or a counsellor, it's just your role to really listen and be empathetic and be able to understand, you know, where that person is coming from. And then at such time, if it's appropriate, to say, have you thought about accessing our EAP, and making it really easy for someone to be able to access. And look, it doesn't happen overnight. It does require a bit of bravery. We've used that word a couple of times, from the manager, to be able to open up that conversation. But I absolutely think it's their responsibility. And, you know, there is a bit of a stigma around, I can't ask people personal questions, and I don't want to cross that line. But at the end of the day, we're all dealing with people, and we're real people as well. So let's just kind of cut out that, you know, work border that we don't want to cross, because we want to make sure our people are okay at the end of the day. And we do have a duty of care to do that. And, you know, I had a bit of a light bulb moment the other day. I was having a conversation with my manager, who so happens to be the CEO and our founder. And, you know, I was telling him about some of the struggles I was having at work at the moment. And he stopped me right in my tracks and said to me, you know, have you thought about speaking to somebody through our EAP to help you deal with some of these work challenges? Because I don't know if I'm the right person for that. And that meant so much to me, being the person who every day is kind of banging this drum to people and making sure they know it's available, to realize that maybe, you know, we've made a bit of groundbreaking here at Pirate, and that this really is starting to become embedded in our conversations that we're having every day. I think that's the most important thing, making it really easy, really accessible, and knowing that it comes from a place of genuine care. Is part of the battle.
Yeah. Okay. I wonder whether, Rose, you could offer a perspective on this, in the sense that I agree with everything you've said there, Ashlee. I think that sounds amazing. I think, you know, create that culture whereby people can have those proactive conversations and signpost if required, and all that sort of thing. You know, I'm thinking about other organizations that I've worked with where perhaps that culture is not quite as mature, I guess, might be the nice way of putting it. How would a manager... So what would the difficulties of a manager be, even signposting these things? You know, because Rose, you mentioned before that, you know, someone might be worried that there's something wrong with them. And then even the fact that you're being signposted to an EAP might, I don't know, could someone get defensive about that? Do you think there's something we need to do to support the managers themselves? What do you think? Can you offer a perspective on that at all?
I don't know. I've never worked with EAPs, and I don't know that much about how that feels for an employee to go to a manager, except that if it's similar to the rest of life, you know, that an individual feels that their life has become really complicated, or a particular issue has become very complicated, and they'd like to perhaps unravel that with someone who is empathic and non-judgmental. What that's like to go to a manager, I can only refer back to what Davina was saying, that there is training given. This is what I understood you saying, Davina, that training is given in the workplace to understand each other better. And so in that case, then a manager would know whether or not to suggest going to an EAP. I'm sorry, that's all I can say about that.
I was just thinking from the human perspective, you know, whether you'd... Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. It's an unfair question to ask you there. I guess the other thing which is in my mind is whether COVID's shifted any of this. A few of you have mentioned, you know, hybrid working and the pros and cons of that. Have you seen access change, or not just the frequency of access to EAP or counselling more generally, Rose, but also the things that people are talking about? Has that shifted at all? Don't mind who wants to take that.
Well, in my experience and through my network, I know that access has increased and waiting lists are getting longer. I used to work with a charity that offered free counselling, and those waiting lists got quite a bit longer. On the other hand, the technological side of it made this more made it more possible for counselors to meet with clients. So like, you know, whereas they were booking a room at the center, and there might be, you know, problems with finding a room on the day when they want it, they could be more flexible and offer a session on Zoom. Yeah, it definitely increased during the lockdown.
Yeah.
I was thinking about the pandemic this morning and how it's an analogy for our experience of our internal life. So I think because everything became quieter, we were working from home, people were possibly looking more into their inner life. And so there was a lot of sort of what I'd call sort of existential questions being asked, you know, things like loneliness or isolation, things which have always troubled people, but more so during the pandemic. So yeah, it definitely had a big impact on people's well-being.
I find that, you know, I find that fascinating, Rose. I find that, you know, I'm really interested in a moment about how people's values potentially are shifting throughout this. You know, again, there's research about this, but people's values shift from more future orientated goals to more emotionally meaningful goals when something like this happens. And there's data that backs that up, and even linked to Davina. We were talking the other day, weren't we, about the great resignation that's apparently coming up and everybody leaving. And part of that could be potentially down to those shifting in values and people kind of taking a step back and saying, like, what really matters to me? So I'm going off topic a little bit, but Davina, I don't know whether you had anything to add about that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I completely agree with everything that Rose has said just there, because we have our team of therapists, which is, you know, they're trained counsellors, psychologists, under that banner. But we would have seen clear correlations between when changes in government regulations changed. And even with the lifting of restrictions and just the anxiety that was being created, and, you know, some organizations were being asked to come back into the office, and people were so worried and concerned about their vulnerable loved ones or children that they were living with. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely one trend that we've seen as Zevo Health, is how intense the ripple effect of changing of restrictions can have on people's well-being and apprehension of going back into an environment which still feels somewhat unsafe. And you know, we all change at different, you know, change and adapt in different ways. And there are some people who, you know, are fine with being back on public transport, back in the workplace, and they feel safe enough in their own mental and physical health. But there is definitely a cohort of individuals who either yo-yo between feeling safe and unsafe, or just people who are not yet ready to be back in the working world. And so that's definitely one trend that we've seen in terms of access to support. But there were also, like, CSO figures from Ireland just showing, you know, I think it was around 75% of 18 to 34-year-olds were saying that the pandemic has negatively impacted their mental health and well-being. And around 15% were saying they felt downhearted or depressed most or all of the time. And that data was collected back in February of this year. So it's probably changed somewhat with, you know, the easing of restrictions and people feeling like they've got some of their support network back, and that life resuming normal kind of cadence and life events, etc. But I think what we're seeing in relation to that, and, you know, just, yeah, as you said, Matt, what is important to me? Can I be a parent and do this really intense job? Do I want to do that? You know, is it important that I work for a company that is meeting my values? And, you know, sustainability and climate change is, you know, at the forefront out of a lot of ethical business practice. So that's calling into question, you know, the moral implications of choosing where you work and whether that aligns to your values. And then the wider questions around well-being, you know, is this environment conducive to my well-being? So lots of things coming up. And I know you mentioned you've gone off on a tangent. I have now as well. And I'm sure Ashlee can probably add to this as well, from what, you know, the changing trends and what people are saying they want their workplace to be, you know. And I think, you know, that belonging piece as well has become so important, especially in the remote way of working. You know, how do you create that sense of belonging? And it has to be authentic. You know, it has to be real. It can't be fake. You know, how do you keep all of that going? And it's causing businesses to maybe think about how they're interacting with one another, and how business objectives and KPIs can still be met. But when you put well-being at the forefront of all of that, everything's going to be done so much more better, because you're managing, you know, you're managing the business from a different perspective, from, you know, that people first perspective. And if your people are well, if they've got what they need to do their job, if the resources are there, you know, they're going to outperform your competitors. They're going to stay with you longer, and they're going to enjoy the journey with you. So there's a lot to consider, but in the end, as we know from psychology, everything is so complex and it all feeds into one another.
Yeah. And I guess it's embedding it into the culture, isn't it? It's embedding it into the culture. So I don't know whether, Ashlee, you've got anything to add on that. Embedding, it sounds like you're doing a pretty good job of embedding it into the culture of your organization. I guess the EAP plays a role in that, but how else do you do that?
I think it is very early days for us still. We went on our mental health journey at Pirate in March this year, a year into the pandemic, you know, after spending a good amount of time, you know, partnering with the right people. And whilst it is early days, to give you a bit of an indication around usage, not that I can compare it to pre-pandemic, but this will give you a good insight. The way that our provider calculates how many sessions we would require as a business over the year is through a formula based on 6 sessions per employee and the previous data. In September, I was made aware that we'd used our annual usage. So 6 months in, there was obviously a moment of pride of, okay, wow, this is really important and it's really making a difference. And a little moment of, oh no, I hope our team are okay. We're obviously using more than what the industry standard was. But, you know, they did report back to me that they have seen 22% of our business take up EAP. And although that's only a fifth, when you put it into perspective, and I'm looking at 100 people in a room, knowing that 22 people there have sought help who maybe might not have unless this was available to them, or thinking, you know, there's 22 people here who might not have felt comfortable coming and talking to me or their manager or going elsewhere. It does really start to hit home. And to that point, Davina, you make around ROI, there are some things you just can't put numbers to, like the impacts it has on your HR team and your managers taking on, you know, that responsibility of helping support people if you don't have those programs in place. So yeah, I was, you know, really pleased to see the engagement on our EAP as a benefit overall. You know, we've had excellent feedback as well from our team. And yeah, I suppose EAP, like you say, Matt, is just one layer of the journey that we're going on. And we are still in like a scale up phase, so working out what's realistic. But I think, yeah, embedding it as a normal part of our conversation day to day, training our managers and our team on this being a very normal thing and very available to everybody. Also, you know, doing the nice things on top, like everyone's upstairs at the moment drinking juices on a 1 hour wellness session through Founded Wellness. And, you know, these are the great things. We did yoga yesterday and they, you know, make people feel really good. And I think that really does show the team that we value your mental health. We value you as a person, your health, as well as what you're adding, to our business.
Yeah. And what you mentioned feedback. What does the feedback on EAP look like?
It's always a tricky one because I never know who's actually seeking counselling or therapy. I just sit patiently waiting for someone to come up and say, hey, I'm using EAP at the moment. This is my experience. And I'm like, great, you're willing to tell me everything. And, just to use one example that, I got some feedback last week from somebody who over COVID, there was a death in the family, and they said to me that had we not had EAP, they would have continued to bury the grief and not have dealt with it. But having this here, they've been able to go on a 6-month journey of recovery. And, just those small anecdotes, and they look you in the eye and say, thank you so much. I appreciate this benefit so much. That's really meaningful and impactful for me as a HR professional, knowing that even if this has just helped one person, so much better off. And, to go on from some more feedback that I receive, we do a whole range of different benefits, from socials to online training and different sort of training offerings, but it's always EAP that I get the really genuine thank you for. So, I think it's just highly impactful stuff to implement as part of a benefits program, as well as, part of the core of your business, that you just absolutely need to have this support.
Yeah. And Rose, you're in those conversations. So what's the feedback? What's the feedback like? What sort of response do you get? Because it must be hard as well, right? Must be, I don't know. Is it hard? Is it difficult having those conversations, or?
Which conversations do you mean? The feedback from clients?
No, sorry. I mean, in the individual engaging with counselling, engaging with talking therapy, having those conversations must be quite difficult. But I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I guess your goal is to move them to a state where actually they feel like they've got something from it and moved on with something that they were bringing to the session. I don't know. What sort of feedback do you get from?
The first that comes to mind is being able to share and offload. So that's one experience, but another experience is, excuse me, is sort of like clearing away all the distraction, things that have been obscuring them from seeing what their real issue is. This can only come from the clients, as they talk, and they themselves obviously hear themselves. It's a strange experience being in a therapeutic space. It's almost as though some kind of vibration occurs when two people connect psychologically. And things come up, things sort of emerge and sort of open up. The person doesn't always, they often don't know what's going to come up. So it's an appreciation for the clarity that they have at the end of that process. Also understanding process in itself, that there's a lot of learning just from the actual engagement with counseling. Like going into, I've mentioned this before, the inner world, going to the inner world and sort of like matching that with what's happening in their external world. And that's called congruence, when there's a sort of like things are feeling smooth, like the relationship between your inner experience and your external experience. So I suppose in the workplace, it might be that your communication is improved greatly, because perhaps you're not going to be as defensive as you were before, when you know more about yourself and you know that these were your issues. You were taking it personally, perhaps. So there's a lot of gratitude for the freedom from all that sort of like the knot of problem or the distraction or the stress.
So the impact's behavioural, isn't it? And emotional for that individual. It's not, ROI is really important. I agree, ROI is important, but it's the emotional and the behavioural impact that you're looking to have as well. Sorry, I've asked all the questions. Alethea, did you have a question to kind of
really
finish?
So thank you everyone. That's been really interesting. I feel like we could probably come back to all of you and have more conversations and hear more our list of questions, as we've barely touched the surface of everything, but what you have shared has been really very insightful from 3 very different perspectives as well, which has been really useful. I guess I just wanted to finish on something that we did touch on, which is, you know, the signposting and being really clear about what's available and what resources are out there. We've talked today specifically about kind of the EAP program and offering, which obviously often it does look like a model of around 6 sessions, and I know you know that's what you've mentioned, Davina. Ash, you mentioned as well around picking a service that fit the culture and the type of people that you have in your organisation, and Rose, you mentioned, you know, that opportunity to access support directly through private counsellors in private practice. And so I just wanted to kind of, I guess, you know, have a quick discussion before we go, and it is 1:20 now, about what those other things are. But so I'll begin with that, because I saw something this morning which I hadn't seen before, which is actually a counselling service which exists through Slack, which I thought was really, really interesting. And of course now we kind of see quite a lot of apps that come up. So Davina, what are you aware of in terms of what the landscape looks like in addition to EAP programs in their kind of more traditional form?
Yeah, I guess the opportunities and like services available are pretty much endless right now, and that's a blessing, but it's also a challenge when you're at the stage where you're going, what do I go for? What do I need? Especially if you've not had experience of accessing support like this before. So, you know, you've got your GP who can refer you into, you know, psychiatrist support or psychologist support or counselling support. So there's the medical route. You've got your self-refer route into EAP and private counselling. There's a whole host of charitable services as well. And that varies country to country as to what you can access. And then with globalization, with the many counsellors are having new guidelines set out to say, how do you practice, you know, if you are working with someone from a different country perhaps. So there's all these other things kind of cropping up, and then you've got so many apps. You know, before we came on, we were speaking about mindfulness and yoga, and those have huge benefits to the nervous system, to just working through certain problems, using your breath in day-to-day dynamics, whether you're going into, you know, just like a challenging discussion, you know, just being aware of internally what's happening, your thoughts, your feelings, you know, your behaviors, just bringing that with you wherever you go. And then, you know, we know the benefits of exercise and how that impacts mental health. Some people don't want to talk about what's happening. You know, it's maybe more distressing for them to open up. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Rose will be able to talk about this as well, you know, the impact of exercise on mental health, as well as potentially with people who are recovering from post-traumatic stress disorder, burnout, for example. It's really thinking about what is going to work for you. And I know this year and last year self-care has been trending quite a lot, but I think it's having that imbalance, because self-care is not enough to manage the treatment of whether it's unmanageable stress or a mental health diagnosis. So I think the emphasis needs to be on, yes, there are things that we can do for ourselves, and there's so many apps and support available in the workplace. We have our support networks, we have all these evidence-based interventions, which includes yoga, meditation and exercise, as well as therapy, which is heavily researched. But I think it's also saying, well, when does my level of distress get too much for me to be able to cope with it by myself? And when do I need to know how to seek support? And sadly, you know, we only know that once we've gone through it. But I would say if we can talk to one another as we're doing now, and sharing that advice, you know, sharing, you know, our experiences, that might help prompt someone or nudge them into the direction of support much earlier than they may do otherwise. So yeah, I think that's such a big question. We could do a whole session just on that.
We could. And we can actually share some practical resources as well as a bit of a follow-up when we share this recording. I'll make sure that there's something attached. so that people can see a summary of all of those kind of different avenues and suggestions. What about you, Rose? Any final?
Well, I was going to say that your response to Davina was really comprehensive. I couldn't add to that, apart from along with self-care. I've been studying recently, because there's so much online now, and a lot of it is free, from sort of well-known therapists who are putting things up on YouTube, is the benefit of self-compassion. And that, they sort of go hand in hand. We think that self-care might be lighting candles and having a nice hot bath, but there's so much more to it. So self-compassion is a good sort of terminology that I've taken on. And it, basically it means being kind to yourself and talking kindly to yourself, or giving yourself a break when you've made a mistake, sort of learning from that. And I think it's really crucial, self-compassion.
And just more practically, Rose, if someone wanted to access a counsellor through a private practice, where can they go to?
The first place I can think of is the BACP website, the British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists. They have a register of counsellors on there, counsellors and psychotherapists. And then also there's the counselling directory, and another organisation called BetterHelp. So I noticed that one of your questions was, what do you do if you, you're going down the private route and you don't, you're not, it doesn't gel with that first counsellor that you've met? Well, I just want to remind people that this is where your autonomy comes in, and using your own voice is, you just find another counsellor. Although bearing in mind that it may be that perhaps the counsellor has brought, like the work that you've done with this counsellor has brought up a challenge for you, and you think, oh, I'm going to leave this now because it's too much. Well, bear that in mind. It's not the fault of the counsellor. It's just that perhaps it's not the right time, or the issue, you're not ready to deal with that issue just now. And that's fine. Counseling is something you can come back to again and again. It's not just for a crisis, it's also for your personal development.
Yeah, I feel like there's probably a lot more questions and insights you could share with us to help people kind of take that step. And so perhaps it's something that we can look at sharing in another discussion sometime. Well, I think we probably do need to wrap this up so that we don't overrun too much. But unless there's any, final comments, happy to take any questions for the people that are here live. But thank you very much, everyone. It's been a really interesting conversation.